Hello everyone, very warm welcome to Ghost Variations episode 9 here on Jessanori, direct from my study. Yesterday we had a nice little visit from the cat in the middle, but today he's actually had his supper already, so he may leave us alone. So back to 1933, and Yeli is back from Dorset, and here is about to have a session with her duo partner, Myra Hess. Myra Hess, cigarette smoke curling around her, listened long and well after Yeli burst into tears in the middle of the Brahms Sonata in G major. In the pianist's Carlton Hill studio, lined with gold-hued hessian and gleaming with sunlight that slanted in from the garden, they were rehearsing for a Wigmore Hall Brahms Centenary concert, at which they would play all 3 of his sonatas. Yeli had been fighting back a longing to tell her duo partner about the visitations through the glass. Many years of working together had taught her that of everyone she knew who understood Schumann and how to play his music, Myra was by far the best. But that of everyone who would ridicule the notion of messages from beyond the grave, she would laugh longest and loudest. Dotted around the studio stood photographs of Myra's family, her parents and siblings, that is. No husband or children for her, any more than for Yeli. She turned down her first love, a violinist named Aldo Antonietti, Italian, yet hailing from Kingston-on-Thames, because she intended to devote her life to music. Nothing should interfere with that. You can't be earnest about more than one thing in life, Myra insisted, and I'd need to be earnest about marriage as well as music, and I can't do that. Aldo wanted her to marry him and stop playing the piano. Balderdash, said Myra. Neither she nor Yeli could understand why a man would fall for a woman with a vocation only to insist she must give it up. Music was, after all, a sizable part of who they were. Yet, if rejecting Aldo had caused Myra pain, Yeli accepted that she'd never know about it. Her friend, sociable though she was, kept such feelings under strict lock and key. Later, Beno Mosejevich proposed, but there had been 2 pianists together in the same home. God help us, never mind the neighbours, Myra joked. Here in St. John's Wood, Myra shared a house with 2 sisters, friends who didn't mind her practising, and she identified in silence with the great rip in the fabric of their lives, having lived through it all with them. They were the only survivors of 5 siblings. Their brother was killed in the war. Afterwards, their 2 younger sisters, grief-stricken, died together of a joint overdose. Nobody knew for certain whether it was accidental or deliberate. Perhaps nobody wanted to know. Myra eventually accepted as her bedroom the one in which the girls' bodies had been discovered. Yeli wondered how she could stand it, but the pianist, throwing open all the windows and applying paint curtains and music of her own, wasn't one for hauntings. Yeli could scarcely bear to set foot in there, so Myra confined their meetings to her studio. A critic once commented in the nicest possible way that Myra resembled a solid, modern, reliable wristwatch fashioned to the latest design, while Yeli was a golden antique pocket watch, the best that money can buy. The pair derived much hilarity from that. There we go, ticking away like time bombs, Myra said. They looked, nonetheless, as different as those imaginary watches would be. Myra was the shorter and rounder of figure, her dark hair draping like angel's wings from the centre parting, above a direct gaze that missed no detail. Yeli was taller, indeed taller and darker than her own sisters, bony and flexible. Sepp used to tease her about being double-jointed. Her posture was open, her movements generous and impulsive, and her laughter as ready as her tears. This time, The tears were sparked by her increasing awareness of another difference between her and Myra. For the pianist, life was a photo, not a drawing, and she could manage it with consummate clarity. She was tougher than Yeli, more practical and astute, a woman of this century, not the last. Was Yeli what the critic had said, an antique admired for her old-fashioned beauty, but created in the past and for the past, useless beyond it? The Brahms sonata's slow movement seemed filled with mourning, chiming so strongly with hers that it felt almost too painful to play. "You have to go to Tom," Myra said when Yeli had explained everything that was going on, except, of course, for the mysterious concerto. "You mustn't think you're being disloyal to Sepp. He's in another world, perhaps, and he won't care. He'd mind if you didn't, I think." She, too, saw Sepp as Yeli's unofficial fiancé. "Tom keeps telling me to concentrate on work and not worry about him," Yeli said, "and I just don't know how I would say goodbye," Myra suggested gently. "That I can understand very well. What would you do if you were me?" "I don't know. It seems to me that you want to be with him, but the prospect of that pain is stopping you, and no wonder. In the end, perhaps you have to trust your instinct." Sepp had died without Yeli being able to tell him that she loved him. Now Tom might too, and she could save neither of them. Her instinct was telling her something different, that she might instead save, even resurrect, another entity. A Schumann concerto? Myra's fingers moved softly across the keyboard, tracing a chorale-like theme that Yeli didn't recognise. "What's that?" she asked. "It sounds like Schubert." "Funny you should say that. Actually, it's a little theme by Schumann that nobody knows, used for some variations by Brahms." Yeli tried not to show the shockwave. "It's for four hands. I've been looking at it with heroine Schara." Heroine was Myra's oldest friend, a fellow former pupil of Tobias Matthay. Rumour has it, according to Uncle Tobbs, that Schumann thought this theme was being dictated to him by the spirits of Schubert and Mendelssohn. Of course, the poor man was losing his mind at the time. Brahms wrote these variations after Schumann died. Isn't it lovely? The music stood open on the piano beside the violin sonata. Yeli peered over Myra's shoulder at the notes. Extraordinary to think that Schumann himself had believed in such things. If she told Myra her own Schumann story, Myra might think that she too was losing her mind. Yet Yeli had seen the words forming with her own eyes, and she knew she hadn't pressed on the glass, and she knew she had never heard before of a violin concerto by Schumann. "It's beautiful," she said. "Do you think it really was dictated by spirits?" Myra burst out laughing, then twirled into a jokey cadence that neither Schumann nor Brahms would ever have written. Yeli's letters from Dorset began to bring her some returns around the time of her birthday in late May, though not all were happy. Armed with her best hat, a sleek black suit and several layers of necklaces, she took up invitations to coffee, tea and sherry. The first of the latter was with the friendliest critic from the Times. He owned a copy of the first edition of the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians and looked up Schumann for her. "No mention of a violin concerto," he said. "None at all. Admittedly, this edition may be out of date. Don't think, though, that if there was a concerto, I'd know about it." Yeli thanked him and went to morning coffee with another critic, James Gambrell, whom she respected yet feared a little. In his study, he adopted the stance of a tutor interviewing a student across a college desk. "My dear Yeli, how nice to see you. But why the devil are you looking for a missing violin concerto by Schumann, or indeed any missing work by Schumann? You are surely aware of the situation vis-à-vis his suppressed compositions." Yeli blinked. Suppressed compositions, plural. Actually, I wasn't, she said, keeping her eyes wide and innocent, trying to let charm make up for her pitiful ignorance. Please tell me. Gambrel took a long inhalation from his pipe. A number of Schumann's late works, he explained, were unpublished or seemed missing. The truth was more awkward. Schumann, he related, spent his last 2 years in a mental asylum at Endenich near Bonn, the culmination of his long illness. All his life he had worked in a ferment of intensity, his highs bringing flurries of inspiration in which he might compose obsessively in one meeting for weeks, months, or more, turning out masterpiece after masterpiece. As for the lows, these lay beyond agonizing and often rendered him unable to write at all. He fell in love with Clara Wieck when she was still in her teens. Her father tried to separate them on the grounds that the unstable Schumann would make a thoroughly disreputable husband for his Clara, a prodigy whom he had raised to be a great pianist, not housewife to a manic depressive composer whose music was too interesting ever to make much money. The young couple took him to court and won the right to marry, which they duly did the day before Clara's 21st birthday. The passing years brought them many children, musical glories, great friendships, but then, Gambrel lowered his voice, calamity. Schumann was quite mad, possibly because he had a malady of an unfortunate origin that resulted in this, namely syphilis. Or perhaps because he had an inherent instability, or I suspect both. Whatever the truth, he went stark, raving nuts. People do say, of course, that a tendency towards these dual extremes is very common among our great artists and can fuel their output, which may well be the case here. But if that was what caught up with him in the end, it was tragic. He himself asked to be sent from his home in Düsseldorf to the asylum because he was afraid he might harm Clara or the little ones. Poor Clara was left with 7 children to bring up on her own. My great-uncle adored Clara, Yeli remarked. We always revered her memory. Of course you would, as your great-uncle Joachim was one of Clara's inner circle of confidants, together with his close friend Johannes Brahms, who was himself in love with Clara, or so we believe. They were a true triumvirate, a triangle of power over the legacy of the unfortunate Schumann. All 3 of them went to Endenich when he was dying. Imagine, Mr. Ragni, they stood by his body together, mourning after his soul departed. Thereafter they kept together and closed ranks. It is perfectly possible that Clara discussed with Joachim, and with Brahms too, whether to suppress some of Schumann's more dubious late compositions. Those they considered might betray the fact that his mind was no longer entirely coherent. But surely Uncle Jo would have... Well, put yourself in Frau Clara's shoes. One does not want one's husband's memory sullied by a work that doesn't do him justice. But why do you think these pieces wouldn't have done him justice? Yeli protested. How can we know if nobody's ever heard them? The chances of there even being a violin concerto are exceedingly slim. Look, he only met Joachim in the early 1850s. As you know, Joachim and Brahms were respectively only about 22 and 20 when they got to know Schumann. So any concerto he wrote for your Uncle Jo would indeed be a late work. It is eminently possible that Clara would have burned it. And if it does exist, it will have been hidden for a reason, namely that it is probably not very good. Best let sleeping dogs lie. Yeli thanked the critic and drank the rest of her coffee, hoping its strength was the only reason she felt so tense. Fancy saying a work must be no good when there was no proof of it even existing. Supposing it did exist, and it was a treasure, and she might find it and play it and prove its worth, whether or not spirits had any part in it. Going home in a cab, she closed her eyes and pictured ecstatic audiences, a new recording contract, a best-selling set of 78s, an American tour, some of which had been elusive of late. But above all, a resurrection, the only one that she could accomplish. At home, she was battling frustration, an increased chance of the piece being real, but no indication of how to follow its trail, when the telephone rang, bringing to her the one person in the world who might know something concrete. Tovey had been off work for a year with health problems, so in her letter she had intimated merely that she wanted to consult him, should he be well enough. "Yeli!" came the high trumpet tones of Tovey himself. "What a plate Gresha! How are ye?" "Donald, how wonderful to hear you! Something astonishing has happened." Unlike the two critics she had spoken to, Tovey had been close to Uncle Yo in person. "It's so peculiar. I need to talk to you about it properly," she said. "Please, can I come up and see you?" That's the end of today's episode. Tune in again tomorrow and we'll meet Tovey. Thank you.